G'day IB psychologists. If you're a student and you're watching this, you're probably looking for studies to avoid when doing the IA. If you're a teacher, you're looking for the studies that you might want to steer your students away from. So I'm going to explain 5 studies that in the past have been quite popular, but I slightly discourage students from choosing, and I'm going to explain why. So I would say the best study for any student for the IA is the one you like, you understand, but most importantly, you can explain using a theory or a model. And the following studies fall down for one or more of these criterion. A lot of students like them, but they struggle to understand them properly, and then that also means they struggle to link them to a theory or model. Ironically, many of these studies link very nicely to background theories and models, but it's just they sometimes are a little bit confusing. So I've got a previous video, if you haven't already seen it, called the best studies for the IB Psych IA. Now, I'm not really going to call this one the worst studies, because actually I think they'd be a little bit misleading. In some regards, many of these studies can be perfect, but they're a little bit like walking a tightrope. If you do it well, you'll be very successful. But if you make a slight mistake, it can have big consequences. So we're going to look at the Stroop effect, Glanzer and Cunitz, Loftus and Palmer, Brewer and Treyens, and Anderson and Pichert. Pichert. I don't know how to pronounce the last name. I've never heard it, to be honest. Now, the Stroop effect. This is so popular. I would recommend do this as a practice in class. Run a practice experiment with it. This with Loftus and Palmer is really popular, and I surveyed students to ask, why is Loftus and Palmer so popular? For me, the not surprising result was it's because they could understand it. It's easy to understand. And the Stroop effect is so popular because it's easy to understand. Now, if you want an easy to understand study, I suggest Bransford and Johnson. Anyway, problems with the Stroop effect is it can be tricky to link to a theory. There are theories of automaticity, but the Stroop effect itself doesn't constitute a background theory. That's one issue. Students do also struggle to describe it accurately, and I'm amazed when I read IAs that students don't just put an image of incongruent and congruent conditions. It's so hard to describe this in words, but so easy to show it in a picture. And a picture paints 1,000 words. So I would always recommend, if you're struggling to describe something verbally, keep trying to describe it verbally, but also just put a picture there to help reinforce it. And in an IA, that would be fine. This is done in psychology articles quite frequently. For example, I think of the disfluency font, hard to read font versus easy to read font. Well, they change the style of the writing to suit the fonts, so we know exactly what they're talking about instead of trying to describe the fonts. Anyway, another problem with Stroop effect is explaining the relevance of the aim. How do we apply the Stroop effect? Now, it's been used, I believe, if my memory serves me rightly, not in memory research, that would be helpful now, schizophrenia, I believe, and some sort of testing, but it's tricky to explain how a Stroop effect is going to have any sort of relevance. And most students, the easiest way, and actually, to be honest, well, no, there are 2 ways I can think of explaining the relevance of the aim. One, and the most common, and I think the best way to explain it, is to look at practical applications. Stroop fails in this regard in my mind. The other way to look at it is the aim of the study is to test the validity of some sort of background theory, but I don't think Stroop effect is relevant for that either. Right. Another thing that students tend to do with the Stroop effect is they change things with no particular purpose. I had students one year change all of these. This was early in my teaching, and they made rainbow colors. And then I didn't catch it until after they did the IA, and I said, why'd you do that? And they said, we were just curious. Now, I love the fact that you're just curious, but really, you should be able to explain and justify all your modifications. And that's going to, and if you can, not just for Stroop effect, but any study, if you can explain the changes you make, that gives you heaps to write about in your exploration, right? Glanzer and Cunitz. Now, it's such a shame that this is a tricky one for students to do because it actually relates to the multi-store model really well. But the problem is that a lot of students don't understand how it relates. Now, I've made whole videos on this particular study, so please do watch those if you're still wanting to do Glanzer and Cunitz. I'm going to make sure I spell and pronounce that name properly. But most students try to do the primacy and the recency effect, and that's where they fall down. And if you make that mistake in the beginning, just that simple mistake in the beginning causes lots of lost marks throughout the AA. So Glanzer and Cunitz, it's another tightrope walk. Could be done properly, but has many limitations. Loftus and Palmer used to be so popular. It is fading in popularity because it's difficult to link to a background theory. You can link it to schema theory, although I really honestly, when I try to think about that, I struggle to have any sort of meaningful explanation that doesn't just sound vague and generalized. So it could have been explained earlier to the misinformation effect, but we now know that effects are not considered theories or models. New this year, May 2021. Now, the other thing with Loftus and Palmer is the first experiment with the 5 verbs actually doesn't really tell us much about the misinformation effect or reconstructive memory. It's the second experiment with the broken glass, yes or no, that really tells us a lot more. And so for your exam tips for Loftus and Palmer, again, I've got a whole video on this. You have to explain that one. But the problem with that is it provides nominal data because it's just categorical. Did you see broken glass? Yes or no. Now you can gather nominal data for your AA. There's no problem with that. But it just can make things a little bit trickier when you have to do the chi-squared test, which is, I find, just slightly more complicated than the Wilcoxon and the Mann-Whitney U test to do for the inferential statistics. And you won't have a measure of spread. So again, you might think that's easier because it's got one less thing to do, but it can just have its own problems. Now, for any experiment, remember, do only 2 conditions and 1 dependent variable. So that's another common mistake students make with Loftus and Palmer. They have all 5 conditions. Brewer and Treyens, this is the office schema study. Now, I've just tracked down the original and had a big read through it because I haven't read it in a long time because I've never had students do this IA. I really don't like it for the IA because one of the most common ones is that students don't conduct it properly. They just put people in a room and see what they remember, but they don't manipulate an independent variable. And looking through the experiment, it was reading it now, it's difficult to see exactly the independent variable. It's to do with recall, and in fact, they had numerous different experiments, and some of them were correlational as well. So it's just tricky there. And the other thing with this is it's going to be time consuming and a practical issue to conduct. Right, so I definitely don't think the juice is worth the squeeze on this one. Make sure you can link the DPM to the study. Well, you can definitely see I've copy and pasted my PowerPoint here. That's the wrong tip. What I would say with this is actually my next tip is what I want to say about practicality. But anyway, that's a copy and paste error. Anderson and A and P. Right, the basic problem with this is it's too complicated. You've got the house buyer schema and the burglar schema, and for the IA, the simpler the experiment, the better. You want 1 manipulation of the independent variable to create 2 conditions, 1 dependent variable. And while Anderson and Pichert, it can be changed, manipulated to simplify it, many students don't, and it's really evident and obvious in the reading of these IAs that students don't fully comprehend what it is that they're trying to accomplish. So like all of these, they come with the same warning from me and I guess this is my advice. Let me give some advice to the teachers first of all. If you're a new teacher to the IA and you're looking for the best studies to recommend, I would encourage teachers to not allow students to do the studies that you as a teacher don't fully comprehend yourself or you can't see how it links, right? And also don't be afraid to have a very limited list. Like to start your first or 2 years of teaching, just have, okay, here are the 5 recommended studies that you can choose from. And that's far better. And for students, my same advice for you really, in that don't replicate a study that you don't fully comprehend yourself. And because this will be definitely your first time going through the AA, I think it's better to choose something a little bit more straightforward. So I really just don't think there's any value in it. Now, if you want the benefit of some of these studies, why you might be choosing them is because they also link with exam topics. Like this can link to schema, so can Brewer and Treyens, Loftus and Palmer for reconstructive memory. But there are other studies that you can do for the A that serve that same purpose. So I don't think this is worth it. And this is similar to Glanzer and Cunitz. If you make one mistake in this experiment, it can cost marks across lots of different criteria. So I just don't think it's worth it. All right. Now, again, I'm always reminding my students that when we are designing research in psychology, it's a balancing act. It's a balancing act between validity and practicality. And then we have to balance that with ethicality, right? So there's 3 things. So we can't always do the thing that's going to create the most valid experiment, because then we also have to consider our time restraints and the practical considerations and the logistics of carrying that out. But then, and also with the ethicality, well, that kind of influences what's going to be the most valid research as well. So those 3 things are a constant juggling act. So just remember that when you're doing your IA. Best of luck. I hope this was helpful. Please post a comment if you disagree with anything I've said, or if you've got questions, pop a comment as well. I'd love to hear from any past students. If you're a past student, graduate, IB, I know you're not going to be watching this. You're getting on with the rest of your life, but your advice would be so valuable for students who are doing this again. So I appreciate that in advance. Resources, links to resources, more resources are in the description. I'm going to keep pumping out videos to help IB psychology students and teachers grapple with this course. All right, so subscribe to the YouTube and the blog as well. There's lots of posts. Everything there is written if you prefer to read it as opposed to listening to my super fast Kiwi accent talk through this. Alrighty, best of luck, and let me know how you go.